But there are things we can do to make the collective bargaining process visible, to make it accessible. There are changes we can make to the governance structure that will allow the people who make the decision on money to be held accountable for how the money's spent. There are changes that we can make in reporting. Go and try and find a union contract on the internet. UTLA, some of these school districts have them, but 90% of them don't. Vallejo just filed bankruptcy because in part they were trying to restrict the cost of union employees in Vallejo. Go try and find any of the firefighters or police contracts in the city of Vallejo. They're not available unless you walk in the door and pick them up. The other thing I would like to point out in my last minute or so of time here, there's been a lot of talk about getting rid of the supermajority. To me, that's absolutely terrifying. Not because I like an ineffective government that goes slowly, although I kind of like aspects of that, but more importantly because this week and this last month we've had a conversation about primary reform. We've had a conversation about redistricting reform. We've had a conversation about the trade-offs between raising taxes and cutting expenditures. We won't have that in a system where one party can simply pass the budget and win. I mean, if the Democratic-controlled legislature had their way to begin with, you would have seen the tax bill increase instead of, in my case, about $1,200, probably in the order of $3,000. And there wouldn't have been a conversation about it. And so the supermajority really does preserve the ability to trigger a conversation each time this comes around. There's some conversation about political reform. The nonpartisan primary obviously will be on the ballot, redistricting in 2012, and probably at some point we need to take a look at term limits. And as happy as I was to get rid of Willie Brown back in the early 90s or late 90s, it's probably time to take a look at that legislation. So I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. We covered a lot of ground. There's obviously a lot more. I'll just put a plug in. I'm working on a book on how we solve the state's budget problems. I'm not sure when it'll be out yet because I keep having to rewrite significant parts of it as things unfold. And so that I welcome questions. Personally, I'd rather see the gasoline tax than the sales tax. The sales tax is sort of the worst case of a tax. We're taking a modestly high tax and we're adding to the top of it. Any economist will tell you that increases the deadweight loss to society. It becomes less efficient. It's a fairly elastic good as well. We've seen consumer spending falling through the floor, raising the price of consumer goods, and I mean that's part of what's driving our recession. Raising that price is probably not the best thing we want to do. A good tax is on something that's inelastic. I think we've got gasoline demand down to the point where it's pretty inelastic. So I would have personally rather seen the gas tax than the sales tax. Well, from a political perspective, this is probably as good as we were going to get. One of the things that happened, not last night, but the night before, was the Republican minority leader, who had put this package together, went to the members and said, look, you either got to support me or replace me. And so they replaced him. And they replaced him with an anti-tax conservative from Temecula. And the thing about it was, the reason why Democrats did not want to go along with the open primary for sure. That was something they absolutely didn't want to have on the ballot. They went along with it because they realized that if we had to start this process all over again, it was a different set of rules. So I mean, in some ways, this deal coming together was a perfect storm. What we should do, I think we need, well, again, I'm writing a book on this, but I mean, I think the key issue is accountability. Californians will pay for services, just like the gentleman said, if they feel like they're getting their money's worth. You see it all the time in local school bond elections. People go out and spend $20 billion to fix their local schools. What we need to do is enhance the linkage between what people pay and what they get for it. And so I would do more compartmentalization of the budget. I think some of the initiatives have done that for some specific areas. But yeah, one example is that I would take the income tax and I would break it into pieces. And I would say school funding comes from the income tax. If the economy goes into a dive, what we will do is we will raise these parts of the income tax to provide funding at this level, which is a maintenance level. It's not a growth level, it will be a maintenance level. And you compartmentalize it. And you say, and this happens automatically. If you want to do anything else, then you've got to go get that 2/3 vote. But you can do this with a 50% vote, and we don't care. So I think that if people see the linkage between what they pay and what they're getting, that will enhance their willingness to deal with the issues. The other thing I think that's absolutely critical that California and the US, and I think President Obama is exactly wrong on this, is you don't want a whole bunch of people who don't pay into the tax system. Because all that does is encourages them to mobilize politically to take money from people who are paying. I think everybody has to participate in our tax system, in our income tax system, directly, so that when we have a debate over schools, it matters to them how well that money is spent. I think you'll see an automatic increase in people's awareness and concern about school district finance, for example, the quality of schools, the effectiveness of the money in schools, if they're paying for it and they feel that they're paying for it. So I think if you draw those linkages and you make everybody participate. Now, I think by making everybody participate, you can lower some of the rates for everybody. But I think that has to happen for everybody to be engaged. Well, legal and illegal immigration is, yeah, I can punt and pretend I'm from California. It's a state, it's a federal problem. No. There's a couple challenges. One is that part of what people assume is the illegal population, a lot of those kids are U.S. citizens at this point. If you look, for example, in education, the anchor baby phenomenon where illegal immigrants come to America, have their children, they are now U.S. citizens. We have to deal with that issue, and that's a federal issue, so I guess I will defer in some ways. But I think that it's going to be very hard and very expensive in part because we're not willing to have an official document that says I'm a citizen. I mean, you can go Xerox your social security card. It's not hard. The Real ID Act has been fought by every state and every libertarian group as a way for government to reach into people's pockets and watch our lives. Until we come up with a document that shows some form of citizenship, it's almost impossible to enforce any legislation that discriminates between illegal and legal residents. And as far as I can tell, there's no interest in America at this point of dealing with the ID question. So I guess my answer is it's very expensive to do it any other way. And since we're not willing to sort of make that public policy trade-off on the other side, I don't see an affordable solution. You know, there's a lot of talk. There's talk about getting rid of the supermajority. My sense is voters won't go along with it. They like the initiative. If you look at the polling, even the PPIC polling that said, would you get rid of the supermajority? Well, when you tell people the sky is falling and it's the end of the world, this week I would. I bet if we go and poll them in 2 months, they'll love it. And I think if it actually came to the ballot, that the supermajority would live. So to say we can't get rid of the supermajority requirement for the ballot, and for the budget, you need a 2/3 vote to raise taxes. And every budget typically requires that. So to say we're going to get rid of the initiative, I think would take something on the order of magnitude 10 times that. So I see it as tremendously popular. I don't see any chance of doing that. I mean, let me just explain the background of the question a little bit. The split roll is really this idea. Right now, the way Proposition 13 was written, the maximum if you own property that it can go up in assessed value is 2% a year, which basically means that your property taxes can only go up 2% a year. There is a debate in the policy community that says that that's not fair to businesses who are starting today. Because I have to go out and buy my warehouse today. If I'm Kohl's, and I used to use this example, but Mervyn's isn't here anymore. But Kohl's and Mervyn's used to be the same store. I think they had the same buyers, I don't know, but they had the same layout, the same inventory, the same target markets. Kohl's was a brand new company in California and had to go out and pay fair market value for property and then pay 3 or 4 times the property tax that Mervyn's, which had been around for 20 years, did. And there was an argument that gave Mervyn's an unfair advantage. So one argument is to say that residences, we protect the residents by having the 2% cap, but for business properties, that we actually allow them to be assessed at fair market value. So that's the idea of the split roll. It has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. It does sort of level the playing field for businesses that are competing, but it's more likely to create turnover in communities. And the big argument against it are the mom and pop shops. You know, it's the tailoring shop, for example, that's in a storefront that all of a sudden would see their property values increase, not because their business has changed, but because the business next door sold for a high price. And that was part of what brought us Prop 13 in the first place, focused on homeowners. So, I mean, I see some value in that. If you were going to do that, I would want to couple it with some other reforms inside the property tax. But I do think you'd want to put protection in for small businesses.